There's something you might have noticed about certain people. Those who seem to carry silence like a second skin, who move through crowds as though they're walking alone in a forest, who smile knowingly when others argue passionately about things that don't really matter. You've probably encountered them. The ones who used to be more involved, more reactive, more present in the endless game of social maneuvering, but who have gradually, almost imperceptibly, stepped back from the whole affair. And if you're honest with yourself, you might recognize something of this pattern in your own life. This strange, unexplainable pull towards solitude, this growing comfort with silence, this subtle withdrawal from the fevered pitch of ordinary human interaction. But here's what's curious. This distance isn't born from misanthropy or social anxiety, or even disappointment with humanity. It's something altogether different, something that can't quite be captured in the usual psychological categories we use to explain why people do what they do. It's as if they've seen something, not with their eyes, but with some deeper faculty of perception, and that seeing has fundamentally altered their relationship with the human drama unfolding all around them. They haven't turned away from life. Rather, they've turned towards something in life that most people are too busy to notice, too distracted to feel, too identified with their own narratives to recognize. You see, what we call spiritual awareness isn't really about acquiring new beliefs or adopting a more enlightened philosophy, or even changing your behavior to match some ideal of how an awakened person should act. It's more like a gradual dissolution of the very framework through which you've been interpreting reality. It's as though you've been watching a movie your entire life, completely absorbed in the plot, emotionally invested in the characters, and then suddenly, perhaps through meditation, or suffering, or some inexplicable moment of clarity, you become aware of the screen itself. And once you see the screen, you can never quite lose yourself in the movie in the same way again. This awareness doesn't make you superior to others, contrary to what the ego might want to claim. In fact, it often makes you feel more vulnerable, more sensitive to the absurdity and tragedy and beauty of existence. You begin to see through the social games that once seemed so important, the status competitions, the endless need for validation, the desperate grasping after security and permanence in a world where nothing stays still for even a moment. And this seeing isn't a judgment, it's simply a recognition. It's like watching children play a game with deadly seriousness, and while you appreciate their total involvement, their beautiful unself-consciousness, you can't quite join in anymore because you know it's a game. You've seen the rules for what they are, arbitrary conventions held together by collective agreement and sustained by the fear of what might happen if we stopped pretending. The distance that spiritually aware people keep isn't a withdrawal from life. It's a withdrawal from the collective trance, from the mass hypnosis that convinces us that the symbols and abstractions we've created are more real than the actual living reality that surrounds us in every moment. They've begun to wake up from the dream of separateness, from the hallucination that you are a separate self, locked inside a bag of skin, defending your territory against a hostile universe. And once this dream begins to dissolve, even slightly, the whole social world that's built upon it starts to feel strangely hollow, like a stage set that looks convincing from the audience, but reveals itself as painted plywood when you go backstage. Consider what happens in an ordinary conversation. Two people meet, and immediately the dance begins, each one presenting a carefully curated version of themselves, monitoring the other's reactions, adjusting their performance based on what seems to be working, trying to make an impression, trying to get something, even if that something is just the validation that they exist, that they matter, that they're not alone in this strange predicament of consciousness. The whole interaction is mediated through layers upon layers of conditioning, social expectation, personal history, and psychological defense mechanisms. It's exhausting, really, though most people don't realize how exhausting it is because they've never known anything else. But someone who's touched even the edges of spiritual awareness begins to feel the weight of all this pretense. They see how much energy is being spent on maintaining these elaborate social facades, how much of human interaction is really just two frightened egos trying to extract a moment of reassurance from each other, how rarely we actually meet each other in genuine presence, without all the armor and performance. And this seeing isn't cynical. There's often tremendous compassion in it, a deep understanding that everyone is doing the best they can with the level of consciousness they have access to. But it does create a natural distance, a space between the spiritually aware person and the mechanical unfolding of social conditioning. This distance manifests in subtle ways. They might pause a beat longer before responding in a conversation, not because they're trying to be difficult, but because they're watching the automatic reactions arise in their mind and choosing whether to identify with them or let them pass. They might seem less impressed by status markers that make others envious: the expensive car, the prestigious job title, the perfectly curated Instagram feed, because they've seen through the game of comparison, recognized it as a hamster wheel that spins faster the harder you run. They might decline invitations to events that once seemed obligatory, not out of rudeness, but out of a growing awareness that life is short and finite and precious, and spending it in situations that require you to be anyone other than yourself is a kind of suicide in slow motion. And here's where it gets interesting. This distance often troubles people. Friends and family members might interpret it as aloofness, as judgment, as some kind of spiritual superiority complex. You've changed, they say, and there's often an accusation in it, an implication that you've broken some unspoken contract to remain the same person you've always been, to continue playing your assigned role in the collective drama. And they're right. Something has changed. But it's not that you've become less human. It's that you've become more real. You've stopped pretending quite so vigorously, stopped performing your identity with quite so much conviction, stopped participating in the mass agreement to take seriously things that are fundamentally absurd. The spiritually aware person begins to live more from essence than from personality, more from presence than from past conditioning. And this subtle shift, invisible to external observation, creates a kind of energetic dissonance with people who are still fully identified with their egoic structures. It's not that one person is better than the other. It's more like they're operating on different frequencies, speaking different languages, playing by different rules. The spiritually aware person has begun to recognize that the entire human game is built on a foundation of concepts and abstractions, and while these can be useful tools, they're not the territory itself. They've started to distinguish between the map and the landscape, between the menu and the meal, between the word water and the actual experience of wetness on your tongue. This distinction might sound trivial, but it changes everything. Because once you see that your entire life has been lived primarily in relation to concepts, concepts of yourself, concepts of others, concepts of how things should be, you realize that you've been living in a kind of virtual reality, a second-hand existence mediated through thought and language and cultural conditioning. And the distance that spiritually aware people keep is really a distance from this virtual reality, from the collective hallucination that mistakes the concept for the thing itself, the symbol for what it symbolizes. Think about how we use language in everyday life. We say, "I am angry," or "I am sad," or "I am anxious," as if these emotional states define our essential being. But from a place of spiritual awareness, you might notice there is anger arising in this moment. There is sadness moving through this bodily experience. There is anxiety manifesting as sensation and thought. The difference seems subtle, almost pedantic, but it's the difference between being trapped in the emotion and having space around it, between total identification and witnessing awareness. And when you're not completely identified with every thought and feeling that passes through consciousness, you naturally become less reactive, less available for the drama and conflict that characterize so much of human interaction. People who are still fully immersed in identification need others to validate their reality, to confirm that their problems are real, that their grievances are justified, that their version of events is the correct one. They're looking for accomplices in their particular story about who they are and what's happening to them. But the spiritually aware person, having loosened their grip on their own story, finds it difficult to enthusiastically support someone else's attachment to theirs. Not because they don't care, often they care very deeply, but because they see the suffering that comes from believing the story too completely, from taking the drama too seriously, from forgetting that the self is a kind of useful fiction rather than an absolute reality. So this distance emerges naturally, not as a strategy or a spiritual practice, but as an inevitable consequence of seeing things as they actually are, rather than as we've been conditioned to see them. And what we discover, as this distance develops, is that it's not really distance at all. It's more like intimacy with everything, and attachment to nothing, closeness without clinging, connection without the desperate need for connection. It's the difference between loving someone because they fill a void in you, and loving them simply because love is what you are when the false self isn't in the way. The conventional understanding of intimacy and connection is actually based on neediness, on the idea that I am incomplete and you have something I need, or that together we can create a fortress against the fundamental loneliness of existence. We're taught to value relationships where people need each other, where there's mutual dependency, where the thought of being alone feels unbearable. But this kind of connection, however common, is built on fear rather than love, on lack rather than fullness. It's two people trying to become whole through each other, which is a bit like trying to fill a bucket with holes by getting another bucket with holes and putting them next to each other. True spiritual awareness reveals a different possibility, that wholeness is not something you achieve through connection with others, but something you discover in yourself, or rather, something you discover yourself to be. And this discovery doesn't make relationship less important. In some ways, it makes relationship more real, more possible, because you're no longer relating from desperation or neediness, but from overflow, from abundance, from a place of already being complete. But this kind of relating is rare in the conventional social world, where most interaction is based on various forms of mutual exploitation, however nicely dressed up in the language of love and friendship and community. Watch what happens at most social gatherings. People arrive with their carefully constructed personas, their rehearsed anecdotes, their strategies for making an impression or avoiding exposure. Conversations skate along the surface, touching on safe topics, weather, work, the latest content everyone is consuming. Beneath this surface, there's often a current of comparison, of sizing each other up, of subtle one-upmanship. Everyone is slightly performing, slightly pretending, slightly defending against the possibility of really being seen. And while this can be pleasant enough, even enjoyable in its own way, it's not real contact. It's more like a choreographed dance where everyone knows the steps and no one dares to improvise. The spiritually aware person often finds these gatherings draining because they're being asked to participate in a performance that they've begun to see through. They're expected to laugh at jokes that aren't funny, to express interest in topics they find superficial, to maintain the fiction that everyone is who they're pretending to be. And while they can do this, awareness doesn't make you incapable of social functioning. It feels increasingly like wearing a costume that doesn't fit anymore, speaking a language that has lost its meaning, playing a game whose rules suddenly seem arbitrary and exhausting. This isn't snobbery or superiority, though it might appear that way from the outside. It's more like the experience of someone who has been living in a dream and is beginning to wake up. The dream isn't bad or wrong. It has its own logic, its own validity within its own frame of reference. But once you start waking up, you can't quite take the dream seriously anymore, even though you're still partially in it. You see the people around you completely absorbed in dream logic, operating according to dream rules, pursuing dream goals, and you understand because you were there too. You know what it's like to be that identified. But you also can't quite join them anymore, at least not with the same innocent, unself-conscious involvement you once had. And so the distance grows, not through effort, but through a kind of gravitational pull toward authenticity, toward what's real, toward moments and people and experiences that don't require you to abandon yourself in order to participate. The spiritually aware person finds themselves increasingly drawn to silence, to nature, to simple presence, to conversations that go beneath the surface, to people who are willing to be vulnerable and real rather than impressive and defended. They start to value quality over quantity in all forms of human connection. Fewer relationships, but deeper. Fewer words, but more truthful. Fewer experiences, but more fully lived. This reorientation often puzzles people who still measure their worth by the size of their social circle. the number of their followers, the fullness of their calendar. They see the spiritually aware person's gradual withdrawal from constant social engagement as a kind of failure, a giving up, a retreat from life. But from the inside, it feels more like a return to life, a coming home to yourself after years of exile in other people's expectations and opinions. It's not about rejecting connection, it's about refusing false connection, about no longer accepting substitutes for the real thing. Think about how much of conventional social life is really about avoiding loneliness rather than creating genuine connection. We surround ourselves with noise and activity and interaction, not because we truly want it, but because we're terrified of the silence, terrified of being alone with ourselves, terrified of the void that seems to open up when there's no external stimulation to distract us. We fill our time with engagements and obligations and entertainments, and we call this a rich social life. But underneath all of it, there's often a desperate quality, a sense of running from something rather than moving towards something. The spiritually aware person has begun to make peace with aloneness, to discover that what we call loneliness is really the absence of connection with ourselves rather than the absence of connection with others. They've learned, or are learning, to be comfortable in their own company, to find the silence nourishing rather than threatening, to meet the void without needing to fill it. And this inner settledness changes everything about how they relate to others. They're no longer coming to relationship from a place of lack, no longer trying to extract something from the interaction to fill the hole inside themselves. They can be present without neediness, engaged without attachment, loving without the desperate quality that characterizes so much of what we call love. This quality of presence, this ability to be with someone without needing anything from them, is perhaps the most valuable gift a spiritually aware person can offer, and it's also one of the rarest things in human relationship. Most of the time, when we're with others, we're partially elsewhere, lost in thought, planning what we'll say next, judging the interaction, comparing it to how we wish it would be, trying to manage the impression we're making. We're not actually here, not actually present, not actually meeting the other person in the living moment. We're relating through the filter of our concepts and expectations and past conditioning. But someone who has touched spiritual awareness, even briefly, knows what presence feels like. They know the difference between being lost in thought about the person in front of them and actually seeing them, between hearing the words someone says and listening to what's being communicated beyond the words, between physical proximity and real intimacy. And once you've tasted this quality of real contact, of genuine meeting, the ordinary level of human interaction can feel painfully superficial, like trying to satisfy your thirst with pictures of water. So the distance continues to grow, but it's a particular kind of distance, a distance from inauthenticity, from pretense, from the exhausting work of being someone you're not. And in creating this distance from falseness, the spiritually aware person often discovers a different kind of closeness, a closeness to what simply is, to the texture and immediacy of present experience, to the subtle currents of energy and feeling that move beneath the surface of things. They become intimate with life itself rather than with their ideas about life, with reality rather than with their interpretations of reality. This intimacy with reality often makes the spiritually aware person seem slightly out of step with the social world, slightly offbeat, not quite in sync with the collective rhythm. They might pause to watch sunlight moving through leaves while others hurry past, absorbed in their thoughts. They might become completely present with a simple activity, washing dishes, walking, breathing, while others are always leaning forward into the next thing, the next goal, the next distraction. They might find profound beauty and meaning in moments that conventional consciousness overlooks entirely, moments too simple, too ordinary, too immediate to be considered significant by minds trained to value complexity and achievement and progress. And this is part of what creates the distance. The spiritually aware person is increasingly living in a different reality than most people, not because they've gone somewhere else, but because they've arrived more fully here. They've stopped living primarily in their heads, in their concepts and narratives and interpretations, and have begun to live more directly from sensory experience, from presence, from awareness itself. They haven't left the world. They've actually entered it for the first time, or at least begun to enter it, begun to make contact with what's actually happening, rather than with their thoughts about what's happening. But let's go deeper into this, because there's something more radical happening beneath the surface, something that goes to the very heart of what we call the self, and what we mean by relationship and separation. The distance that spiritually aware people keep isn't ultimately about physical or social distance at all. It's about a fundamental shift in the understanding of what you are. And once this shift begins to occur, the entire framework of self and other, of me here and you there, starts to reveal itself as a kind of elaborate fiction, a convincing illusion that we've mistaken for reality. You see, from the moment we're born, or rather, from the moment the capacity for conceptual thought develops, we're taught that we are separate selves, isolated subjects, looking out at an objective world. We learn to say I and me and mine, and with these words comes a whole structure of identification, a whole way of organizing experience around a central reference point that we call ourselves. And this sense of being a separate self isn't just a thought, it's a felt experience, a contraction, a tension, a sense of being located somewhere behind the eyes, looking out at everything else. This experience of separateness is so fundamental, so pervasive, so seemingly obvious that we rarely question it. Of course I'm separate from you. Here's my body, here's yours. Here are my thoughts, here are yours. Here's my life, here's yours. The boundary seems clear, the separation undeniable. And based on this separation, we build everything else. The need to defend our territory, to secure our survival, to compete for resources, to distinguish ourselves from others, to create an identity that proves we're special, that proves we matter, that proves we exist as something more than just another temporary arrangement of matter and energy in an indifferent universe. But spiritual awareness begins to dissolve this hallucination of separateness, not through belief or philosophy, but through direct seeing, through an immediate recognition that what you actually are is not the separate self at all, but the awareness in which all experience appears. You are not the contents of consciousness, the thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions, but the consciousness itself, the open space of awareness in which all these phenomena come and go, like clouds passing through the sky. And here's the extraordinary thing. This awareness that you discover yourself to be isn't personal, isn't separate, isn't really yours at all. It's the same awareness that's looking out through every pair of eyes, the same consciousness that's appearing as every experiencing subject. The separation between your consciousness and my consciousness is conceptual only. In reality, there's just consciousness, just awareness, just this knowing that's knowing itself through infinite perspectives simultaneously. When this recognition begins to dawn, and it usually comes in glimpses rather than as a permanent state, the entire basis for keeping distance from others collapses, because the other is revealed to be yourself in a different form. The person in front of you isn't really separate from you. They're another appearance of the same consciousness, another movement of the same life, another expression of the same underlying reality. And yet, paradoxically, this realization of non-separation often intensifies the need for distance from conventional social interaction, because most human relating is predicated on the assumption of separation, on the fiction of separate selves, trying to bridge the gap between them. Think about it. The whole structure of conventional relationship is based on an attempt to overcome loneliness, to escape the isolation of the separate self. I am here, separate and alone, and you are there. And through relationship, maybe we can alleviate the fundamental pain of this separation, at least temporarily. So we reach for each other, we cling to each other, we try to lose ourselves in each other, all in an attempt to escape the prison of the separate self. But this kind of relationship, however common, is actually a reinforcement of the illusion it's trying to escape. It confirms that we are indeed separate, that the gap is real, that we need each other precisely because we're not each other. But the spiritually aware person has begun to see through this whole structure. They've recognized that the loneliness we're trying to escape through relationship isn't caused by being separate from others. It's caused by being separate from ourselves. Or more accurately, it's caused by identifying as the separate self in the first place. The real aloneness, the existential isolation that drives so much of human behavior, is the feeling of being cut off from the totality, of experiencing yourself as a fragment rather than as the whole, of believing you're a wave that's somehow separate from the ocean. And once you glimpse that the separation is illusory, that you and the ocean are not two different things, the desperate quality drops away from relationship. You no longer need others to complete you because you're already whole. You no longer need validation because your existence doesn't depend on being seen or acknowledged by anyone else. You no longer need to defend your territory because you realize there's no territory. There's just the open space of awareness in which all experience appears and disappears, and that space has no boundaries, no inside and outside, no self that needs defending. This realization doesn't make you indifferent to others. In fact, it can open up tremendous compassion, because you see that everyone is suffering from the same fundamental misidentification. Everyone is caught in the same dream of separation. Everyone is trying to find through achievement and acquisition and relationship what can only be found through seeing through the separate self altogether. But it does create distance from the conventional ways people try to alleviate their suffering, because you've seen that these strategies, however well-intentioned, are actually strengthening the very problem they're meant to solve. Someone who has touched this realization can't quite participate in the normal games of self-improvement, self-development, self-actualization with the same enthusiasm anymore, because they've seen that the self we're trying to improve is itself the problem, that you can't solve the illusion by rearranging the furniture of the illusion. You can become a better, more successful, more psychologically healthy, separate self, but you're still operating within the paradigm of separation, still reinforcing the fundamental error at the root of all suffering. And this is where the distance becomes most pronounced, because the entire culture we live in is built on the assumption of the separate self and the validation of its project. Everything around us, the education system, the economic system, the political system, the entertainment industry, the self-help movement, even most of what passes for spirituality, is designed to help the separate self become more secure, more successful, more happy, more fulfilled. But none of it questions whether the separate self actually exists in the way we assume it does. None of it investigates the very foundation upon which all these improvement projects are built. The spiritually aware person has become interested in this foundation, in the very structure of self and suffering and separation. And this interest naturally draws them away from the surface level of existence where most people operate, where the question is always, how can I get what I want, rather than, what am I that wants? It draws them toward silence, toward introspection, toward those rare individuals who are also questioning the fundamental assumptions, toward teachings and practices that point toward liberation rather than toward better imprisonment. But here's what's subtle about this. The distance isn't ultimately about physically withdrawing from people or society. You can be in the midst of tremendous activity, engaged in work and relationship, and all the ordinary stuff of life, and still maintain this inner distance, this space of not being fully identified with the drama, of not believing completely in the story of the separate self. The distance is more like an inner freedom, a looseness of identity, a capacity to play the role without believing you are the role. This is what the Zen tradition points to when it talks about being in the world but not of it, about functioning fully while remaining empty, about acting without the actor. It's possible to go through all the motions of conventional life, to work, to relate, to participate, without the underlying belief that sustains the sense of separation. You can speak and act as though you're a separate person, because that's the language and framework that makes practical communication possible, while simultaneously knowing that this separate person is a useful fiction rather than an ultimate reality. Living from this understanding is paradoxical and subtle. You're engaged but not attached, involved but not entangled, responsive but not reactive. You fulfill your responsibilities, maintain your relationships, participate in society, but there's a transparency to it all, a recognition that you're playing a part in a cosmic drama, and while you play your part fully, you don't mistake the part for what you actually are. You're like an actor who becomes so skilled that they can give a completely convincing performance while never losing awareness that they're acting, who can cry real tears for the character while knowing they themselves aren't crying. And this brings us to something that might seem contradictory at first. The spiritually aware person who keeps their distance from conventional social engagement often experiences a more profound connection with life than those who are constantly surrounded by people and activity. The distance from false connection opens up the possibility of real connection, not connection based on need and lack and the attempt to overcome separation, but connection based on the recognition of unity, on the seeing that there's really only one thing happening here, one consciousness appearing as multiplicity, one life expressing itself through infinite forms. When you're not identified with being a separate self, when you've seen through the illusion at least to some degree, then every moment becomes an encounter with yourself, not your personal self, but your true nature, the awareness that you are. The tree you're looking at isn't separate from the looking. The sound of traffic isn't separate from the hearing. The sensation of breath isn't separate from the awareness of breath. It's all one seamless movement, one undivided wholeness, and you are not separate from it. You are it, experiencing itself from this particular perspective, in this particular form. This recognition transforms the entire quality of experience. Instead of feeling like a separate subject locked inside a head, defending yourself against an alien world, you begin to feel like the world experiencing itself from within. The boundary between inner and outer becomes porous, questionable, ultimately arbitrary. Where exactly do you end and the world begin? Is the air you're breathing inside you or outside you? Is the light entering your eyes part of you or part of the world? Is the thought arising in your mind, your thought or just thought appearing in consciousness, with no owner, no thinker separate from the thinking? These questions aren't abstract philosophical puzzles. They're pointers toward direct experience, toward a way of being in the world that's radically different from our ordinary mode of consciousness. And when you begin to live from this recognition, even intermittently, the whole motivation for social engagement, as we usually understand it, falls away. You're no longer trying to get anything from others because you've discovered that you already are everything. You're no longer trying to become someone because you've seen that what you are has never not been present. You're no longer trying to leave a mark on the world because you've realized that you are the world, that there's no separation between the artist and the canvas, between the dancer and the dance. Does this mean the spiritually aware person becomes passive, uninvolved, withdrawn into some blissful state of transcendence? Not at all. In fact, the opposite can be true. When you're not constantly obsessed with your own story, your own problems, your own need to become something other than what you are, tremendous energy becomes available for genuine creativity, for spontaneous response to what life is asking in each moment, for engagement that's free from the weight of self-concern. But the quality of engagement is different. It's not driven by the need to prove something, to achieve something, to become someone. It arises spontaneously from the situation itself, from what wants to happen, through this particular form, in this particular moment. There's no strategy, no calculated self-interest, no underlying agenda of self-improvement or self-aggrandizement. There's just response, pure and simple, like water flowing downhill, like a tree growing toward light, like the body breathing without anyone trying to breathe. This kind of spontaneous, agenda-free engagement is rare in the conventional world, where almost everything is motivated by some form of self-interest, however subtle or disguised. We help others to feel good about ourselves, to earn moral credit, to secure reciprocal favors in the future. We create art to be seen and validated, to leave a legacy, to prove we're special. We seek spiritual experiences to become more enlightened, to transcend our problems, to achieve some superior state of consciousness. Even our apparent selflessness is usually serving the self in some hidden way. We're investing in our self-image, building our identity as a good person, trying to escape the guilt of being human. But the spiritually aware person has begun to see through these subtle mechanisms of self-interest, not through being more moral or disciplined, but through seeing that the self these mechanisms serve is illusory in the first place. When there's no separate self to benefit, the whole structure of self-serving behavior becomes absurd, like trying to save money in a bank account that doesn't exist. Action still occurs, perhaps more freely and appropriately than before, but it's not performed by someone for the benefit of that someone. It's just happening, just arising and unfolding according to its own nature, without a doer behind it orchestrating everything for personal gain. This might sound mystical or abstract, but it's actually the most natural, ordinary thing in the world. Right now, as you're reading these words, is there really a someone separate from the reading who is reading? Or is there just reading happening, just seeing, just understanding arising, without anyone needing to make it happen? When you look at something, do you actively do the seeing? Or does seeing simply occur when the eyes are open and directed towards something visible? When a thought appears in your mind, did you think it, or did it simply arise by itself, emerging from the unknown like a bubble surfacing in water? If you look closely at direct experience, you'll find that there's no evidence for the doer, no proof of the separate self that we assume is running the show. There's just experience happening, sensations, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, all arising and passing in the open space of awareness, with no controller, no entity standing apart from the experience controlling it. The sense of being a separate self, a doer of deeds and thinker of thoughts, is itself just another appearance in consciousness, another thought, another sensation of contraction that we've mistaken for what we actually are. And when this is seen, really seen, not just intellectually understood, the whole project of life as we've conceived it collapses, not in a tragic or nihilistic way, but in a liberating way, because you realize that the burden you've been carrying, the weight of being a someone who has to figure everything out and make the right choices and become something worthy, was always imaginary. There was never anyone carrying that burden. There was just the thought of someone, the sensation of someone, appearing in the same consciousness where everything else appears. This recognition is why spiritually aware people often seem to care less about the things that motivate most people: the pursuit of success, the accumulation of wealth, the achievement of status, the creation of a legacy. It's not that they don't participate in these things. They might work, create, build, achieve just as much or more than anyone else. But the inner quality is different. There's no existential weight to it, no feeling that their worth as a person depends on the outcome, no desperate need to prove something or become someone. They're playing the game without the underlying belief that the game is what they are, without forgetting that what they truly are is the awareness in which the whole game appears. And this lightness, this freedom from self-concern, can be unsettling to people who are still fully identified with the game, still believing that winning or losing actually matters in some ultimate sense. The spiritually aware person's lack of investment can seem like indifference, their detachment like coldness, their freedom like irresponsibility. Why don't you care more? People ask. Why aren't you more ambitious, more driven, more concerned about making something of yourself? But the question reveals the assumption that we are supposed to care about making something of ourselves, that the project of self-improvement and self-development is what life is about, that our worth is measured by how much we've achieved, accumulated, or become. The spiritually aware person has seen through this assumption not through nihilism, but through recognizing that what they actually are has never needed improvement, has never been incomplete, has never been absent. The true self, if we can call it that, is the awareness that's already here, already whole, already free, already everything it could possibly be. So the distance continues, not as a rejection of life, but as a falling away of false motivation, as a recognition that most of what drives human behavior is based on a mistaken identity, on believing you're something you're not, and then spending your whole life trying to make that imaginary something into something better. And once this is seen, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the innocent involvement in the self-improvement project, can't believe in it with the same conviction, can't take it quite as seriously as you once did. There's something else that happens as spiritual awareness deepens, something that intensifies the sense of distance, even as it reveals a more profound intimacy with existence itself. The spiritually aware person begins to recognize that everything they've been taught about reality, about the nature of existence, about what matters and what doesn't, is fundamentally backwards. The culture we live in operates on the assumption that the material world is primary, that consciousness is a byproduct of matter, that we are essentially biological machines that have somehow, through evolutionary accident, developed the capacity for self-awareness. And based on this materialist assumption, we're taught that what's important is what can be measured, quantified, possessed, and controlled. Money, property, physical health, social status, material comfort. But spiritual awareness reveals the exact opposite. Consciousness isn't a product of matter. Matter is an appearance in consciousness. The entire physical universe, with all its galaxies and atoms and evolutionary processes, exists as an experience in awareness. And without awareness, there's no universe at all, at least not as we know it. This doesn't mean the physical world is unreal or illusory in some simplistic sense. It means that the physical world is real as experience, as appearance, but not real as something existing independently of the consciousness that knows it. This reversal of perspective changes everything. If consciousness is primary, if awareness is the fundamental reality in which all experience appears, then the whole project of finding fulfillment through external acquisition is revealed as absurd. You're trying to find yourself, trying to find peace, completion, wholeness, by manipulating appearances within yourself, by rearranging the furniture of consciousness in the hope that some particular arrangement will finally bring satisfaction. But it's backwards, because what you're looking for is what's already here, already present, already the case. It's the awareness itself, the consciousness in which all experiences come and go, including the experience of seeking. The spiritually aware person has begun to reorient toward this fundamental dimension of existence, toward awareness itself rather than toward the contents of awareness. And this reorientation naturally creates distance from a culture that's almost entirely focused on content, on getting more, doing more, becoming more, experiencing more, achieving more. The culture says, accumulate enough, achieve enough, experience enough, and you'll finally be happy, finally be complete, finally be enough. But spiritual awareness reveals that this enough will never arrive through accumulation, because the sense of not being enough comes from identifying with the separate self in the first place, and no amount of addition to the self can solve a problem created by the belief in the self. So the spiritually aware person begins to move in a different direction, not toward accumulation, but toward subtraction, not toward becoming someone, but toward seeing through the someone who's trying to become. They become interested in what remains when everything that can be removed is removed, when the roles are stripped away, when the achievements are set aside, when the identity is relaxed, when the story of me is seen through. And what remains is simple presence, pure awareness, the consciousness that was here before the story of self began and will be here after it ends, the space in which the entire drama of personhood appears and disappears like a wave arising and subsiding in the ocean. This investigation, this turning toward the source rather than toward the contents, often requires solitude. Not because awareness can only be discovered alone, but because the social world is constantly pulling us back into identification, constantly reinforcing the story of the separate self, constantly inviting us to forget what we actually are and pretend to be the character we're playing. When you're surrounded by people who believe completely in their own characters, who are fully immersed in the drama, it's difficult to maintain the perspective that sees the drama as drama, the character as character, the self as a convention rather than a reality. This is why you'll find that spiritually aware people often seek out silence, nature, meditation, contemplation, not because they're escaping from life, but because they're trying to remain in contact with what's real beneath the cultural conditioning, beneath the noise of the collective dream. In silence, it's easier to notice awareness itself rather than just its contents. In nature, it's easier to feel the aliveness that animates all forms rather than getting lost in the particular form you happen to inhabit. In solitude, it's easier to distinguish between your authentic responses and the conditioned patterns you've learned to perform. But here's what's paradoxical. This movement towards solitude isn't antisocial in any conventional sense. In fact, the person who has discovered their own completeness, who has found the source of peace and wholeness within themselves, is often more capable of genuine relationship than someone who's looking to relationship to fill the void inside them. When you're not needy, when you're not trying to extract something from the interaction, when you're not performing for validation or defending against exposure, you can actually meet another human being in present moment awareness, without the filter of all the conditioning and expectation and past hurt that usually mediates human contact. This quality of meeting is rare, and it's what spiritually aware people are often seeking when they do engage socially. Not the performance and pretense that characterize most social interaction, but actual contact, actual presence, actual seeing and being seen. And because this is so rare, they naturally withdraw from situations where it's not possible, where the social script is too rigid, where everyone is too defended, where the whole interaction is really just people trading rehearsed stories and maintaining comfortable illusions about themselves and each other. The spiritually aware person can sense immediately when they're in the presence of someone who is available for real contact, and when they're in the presence of someone who is completely identified with their persona, who has no space around their thoughts and feelings and stories, who is the character they're playing, rather than the awareness in which the character appears. And while they can interact superficially with anyone, they're not handicapped in normal social functioning. They find deep satisfaction only in encounters where both people are willing to drop the armor, to be vulnerable, to meet in the space of not knowing rather than in the security of rehearsed identity. This selectivity can seem elitist or judgmental to those who haven't experienced what real contact feels like, who don't know the difference between genuine meeting and the social performance that passes for connection in most contexts. Why do you have to be so intense? People ask. Why can't you just relax and have fun? But the spiritually aware person has discovered that what most people call relaxing and having fun is actually a form of tension, a kind of defended against something, a way of avoiding the vulnerability and immediacy of real contact. They've found that there's a deeper relaxation available, a more profound joy, a more satisfying connection that only becomes possible when we stop defending, stop performing, stop trying to control how we're perceived, and just allow ourselves to be as we actually are in this moment. And this, as we actually are, isn't fixed or stable. It's fluid, changing, arising fresh in each moment without being bound by the past or by the need to maintain consistency with some image of ourselves. When you're not identified with being a particular someone, you're free to respond spontaneously to what's actually happening rather than reacting mechanically from conditioning. You can be serious one moment and playful the next, vulnerable one moment and strong the next, without needing these shifting qualities to add up to a coherent identity that makes sense across time. This fluidity, this freedom from the tyranny of consistent selfhood, is deeply liberating, but it's also deeply unsettling to people who are still invested in being a particular someone, who need others to remain stable and predictable so they know how to relate to them. I don't know who you are anymore, they say, and what they mean is, you're not acting consistently with the role I've assigned you, with the version of you I've constructed in my mind, with the function you're supposed to serve in my story. And the spiritually aware person, hearing this, recognizes that they're being asked to betray themselves in order to maintain someone else's illusion, to play a part that's no longer authentic, just to keep the social machinery running smoothly. And so we come to perhaps the deepest reason that spiritually aware people keep their distance. They've begun to see that the entire human world is built on agreement to believe in things that aren't real. Not real in the sense that they exist as lived experience, rather than as abstract concepts. We believe they're like someone who knows they're in a dream, but continues to navigate the dream world skillfully, understanding that while the dream isn't ultimately real, it has its own relative reality within its own frame of reference. This double vision, seeing both the conventional truth and the ultimate truth simultaneously, is what allows the spiritually aware person to function in the world, while maintaining inner freedom from the world. They can play by the rules without believing the rules are absolute. They can pursue goals without becoming attached to outcomes. They can fulfill responsibilities without feeling that their essential being depends on how well they fulfill them. They've discovered a place to stand that's outside the entire system of conventional reality. And from this place, the system looks completely different. Not wrong or bad, but transparent, arbitrary, not nearly as serious as everyone seems to think it is. And this perspective naturally creates distance, because most people are completely immersed in the system, completely identified with the game, unable to see that there's anything outside of or beyond the conventional reality they've been taught is the only reality. They're defending beliefs they don't realize are beliefs, pursuing goals they've never questioned, operating according to conditioning they don't know is conditioning. And when they encounter someone who has begun to wake up from the collective trance, there's often confusion, discomfort, sometimes even hostility, because the awake person is an implicit challenge to the entire structure everyone else is invested in maintaining. The spiritually aware person often finds themselves in the strange position of seeing clearly that the emperor has no clothes, while everyone around them is praising his magnificent outfit. Do you speak up and point out the obvious? Or do you remain silent, recognizing that people aren't ready to hear it, that they need the illusion, that the illusion is serving some function in their lives that they're not ready to relinquish? Most often, the spiritually aware person learns to remain silent, to keep their seeing to themselves, to allow others their illusions while gently maintaining their own clarity. This silence isn't passive or weak. It's a recognition that consciousness evolves at its own pace, that you can't wake someone up who isn't ready to wake up, that the most helpful thing you can often do is simply be present as a reminder that there's another way of seeing, another way of being, another possibility beyond the conventional life that most people accept as the only option. You become a living question mark, a walking koan, someone whose very presence suggests that the assumptions everyone else takes for granted might not be the whole truth. And gradually, over time, this presence begins to attract others who are also questioning, who are also feeling the limitations of conventional consciousness, who are also sensing that there must be something more than the endless cycle of desire and disappointment, achievement and emptiness that characterizes ordinary human life. The spiritually aware person often finds that they don't need to seek connection. The right connections find them, drawn by something in the energy or vibration or quality of presence that recognizes itself across the apparent separation of different bodies. These connections, when they occur, often have a different quality than conventional relationships. There's less need for explanation, less requirement for constant contact, less pressure to maintain the relationship through effort. Two people can meet who are both living from awareness rather than from ego, and there's an immediate recognition, an immediate understanding, an immediate intimacy that doesn't require years of building trust and sharing history. They know each other, in a sense, because they're both in contact with the same source, both resting in the same awareness, both seeing from the same place, despite appearing as different forms. This is what spiritual traditions mean when they talk about Sangha, or spiritual community, not just a group of people who believe the same things or follow the same teacher, but a community of individuals who are waking up from identification with the separate self, who are discovering their true nature as consciousness itself, who can meet each other in that recognition rather than in the usual tangle of personality and conditioning. And while these communities can form, they often remain loose, informal, not bound by the usual structures and hierarchies that characterize conventional organizations, because people who are waking up from the dream of separation don't need external authority or structure to tell them what's real. But even in spiritual community, the spiritually aware person often maintains a certain independence, a certain aloneness that can't be breached even by the most profound connection. Because ultimately, what you are is alone, not alone in the sense of lonely or isolated, but alone in the sense of all one, complete unto itself, not actually separate from anything, but also not needing anything outside itself to be whole. This aloneness is your true nature, and discovering it is both liberating and sometimes terrifying, because it means that no relationship, however beautiful, can ever complete you, can ever give you what you're really looking for. What you're looking for is yourself, not your personality, not your history, not your body or mind, but the consciousness that you are, the awareness that's been here all along, quietly witnessing the entire drama of your life without ever being touched or changed by it. And this consciousness doesn't need relationship to be complete, doesn't need validation to exist, doesn't need anything at all, because it's already everything, already the totality, appearing as this particular point of view, this particular expression, this particular form. When you discover this, when you really see that what you are is the whole appearing as a part, the absolute appearing as the relative, the infinite appearing as the finite, the need for constant social engagement drops away because you're no longer trying to find yourself through others, no longer trying to complete yourself through connection, no longer trying to prove your existence through being seen and acknowledged. You exist completely and absolutely, regardless of whether anyone notices or not. You are with or without relationship, with or without recognition, with or without any of the external markers that we usually use to convince ourselves that we're real and we matter. And this recognition is the ultimate freedom, but it's also the ultimate aloneness, because there's literally no one else here. There's only consciousness appearing as multiplicity, only awareness knowing itself through infinite forms, only the one pretending to be many. And while this can be expressed through intimacy and connection and relationship, it can never be fully shared, because there's no separate other to share it with. Every apparent other is yourself in disguise. Every relationship is really the self relating to itself. Every connection is consciousness playing at being divided so it can experience the joy of reunion. So we arrive at the heart of the matter, the core understanding that explains why spiritually aware people keep their distance. They've recognized that the distance was never real in the first place, that separation is the illusion and unity is the truth. And once this is seen, the whole motivation for seeking connection in the conventional sense dissolves. What remains is a different kind of relating, a different quality of engagement that's based not on need, but on love. Not personal love, not love as attachment or desire or preference, but love as the natural expression of recognizing yourself in everything, as the spontaneous response of the heart when it's not contracted around defending a separate self. This love is utterly impersonal and yet completely intimate, detached and yet fully engaged, free from need and yet capable of profound care. It doesn't depend on getting anything back, doesn't require reciprocation or acknowledgement, doesn't diminish when it's not returned. It's simply what you are when the illusion of separation isn't obscuring your true nature, when the defenses are down, when the armor of the separate self isn't needed, because you've recognized there's nothing separate that needs defending. And this love, this awareness expressing as love, is what the spiritually aware person has become interested in, what they're learning to live from, what draws them more than all the conventional motivations and pursuits that drive ordinary human behavior. They're not trying to become more loving in the sense of developing a personality trait or moral virtue. They're discovering that love is what they are when they're not being anything else, when they're not performing, not defending, not trying to become or achieve or secure anything. This discovery changes the entire relationship with distance and closeness, because you realize that you can be utterly alone and yet completely intimate with all of existence, or you can be surrounded by people and yet fundamentally isolated in your separate sense of self. The distance or proximity of other bodies becomes irrelevant to the question of connection, because connection happens at the level of awareness, and awareness is everywhere equally present, in solitude and in company, in silence and in conversation, in stillness and in activity. The spiritually aware person has begun to taste this freedom, this capacity to be equally at ease alone or with others, equally content in silence or in speech, equally peaceful in activity or rest. They've discovered that peace isn't a particular state or circumstance, but the nature of awareness itself, always present beneath the fluctuations of experience, always available when you stop trying to get somewhere other than where you are, when you stop trying to be someone other than what you are. And from this peace, this contentment with what is, action arises that's free from the desperation that characterizes so much of human doing. The spiritually aware person can engage fully with life, can work, create, build, relate, participate, but without the underlying anxiety that drives people who are trying to prove something, escape something, or become something. They're not playing to win because they've seen that the entire game is optional, that their essential being doesn't depend on any outcome, that what they truly are was never at stake in the first place. This freedom from self-concern can look like distance, can feel like aloofness, can be misinterpreted as not caring. But it's not that they don't care, it's that they care without the contraction, without the fear, without the need for things to be different than they are. They can care deeply about others, about the world, about their work, but it's a caring that's not tangled up with their own identity, not driven by the need to be seen as a good person, not motivated by the fear of being inadequate or unworthy. This untangled caring, this love without agenda, is what humanity needs most and yet understands least, because we've been taught that love means attachment, that caring means suffering with, that compassion means taking on others' pain as your own. But the spiritually aware person has discovered a different kind of love, one that can hold suffering without being destroyed by it, that can witness pain without needing to fix it immediately, that can be present with what is without collapsing into despair or turning away in denial. This presence, this capacity to be with what is, requires a kind of inner strength that most people haven't developed, because we've been taught to avoid discomfort, to seek pleasure and escape pain, to manipulate our experience to match our preferences. But life doesn't conform to our preferences. It unfolds according to its own nature, its own intelligence, its own mysterious purpose that we can never fully understand. And the spiritually aware person has begun to align with this unfolding rather than fighting against it, has begun to trust the process rather than trying to control it, has begun to participate in life rather than trying to dominate it. This alignment with what is, this surrender to the flow of existence, naturally creates distance from a culture that's built on the opposite principle, on the belief that we must impose our will on reality, must make things happen, must control and manipulate and force the world to give us what we want. The spiritual path goes in the opposite direction, toward acceptance rather than resistance, toward allowing rather than forcing, toward receiving rather than grasping, toward being rather than becoming. And so the spiritually aware person gradually becomes a kind of anomaly in the modern world, someone who's not constantly striving and achieving and accumulating, someone who's content with less rather than always wanting more, someone who finds fulfillment in being rather than in doing, someone who's discovered that the peace they were seeking through all their efforts was always available, always present, always just here in the simplicity of this moment, this breath, this awareness that's aware of all of it. This discovery doesn't mean the end of activity or engagement. In fact, some of the most productive, creative, impactful people in history have been those who've touched this recognition of their true nature. But the quality of their activity is different. It's not driven by lack or fear or the need to prove something. It arises spontaneously from the situation itself, from what wants to happen, from what the moment is calling for, without any separate doer who's trying to get something for themselves. And ultimately, this is why spiritually aware people keep their distance, not because they're rejecting life or withdrawing from the world, but because they've found what everyone is looking for in all the wrong places. They've discovered that what we're all seeking through our endless pursuit of more success, more recognition, more experience, more connection, is actually what we are, always have been, and always will be. The simple awareness that's reading these words right now, the consciousness that's aware of this moment, the space in which all experience appears and disappears, and having found this, or rather, having recognized that it was never lost, they naturally rest in it more, naturally orient toward it more, naturally allow it to inform how they live and relate and engage with the world. They don't need the constant stimulation and distraction that most people require to avoid feeling the emptiness they fear. is at the core of their being. They've discovered that the emptiness isn't empty at all. It's full, infinitely full, the source of everything, the ground of all being, the consciousness that contains and creates and sustains the entire manifest universe. So they keep their distance, not from life, but from the dream of separation that most people still believe in. They keep their distance from the noise and complication and drama that comes from identifying as a separate self. They keep their distance from the exhausting work of being someone, maintaining someone, defending someone, improving someone. And in this distance, they discover a closeness that's more intimate than any personal relationship could ever be. The closeness of being everything, of recognizing yourself as the awareness in which all experience appears, of knowing that you and the universe are not two separate things, but one seamless, undivided, infinite reality expressing itself through this particular form, in this particular moment, for no reason other than the sheer joy of being.